This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 39 of season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, September 25th, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago. The first section this week is the About Town section. The electric cars were obliged to submit to an accidental standstill near Crystal Lake, a little way out of North Chelmsford, last week Friday. The running gear got out of gear and could not be coaxed back to obedience for several hours. Coaxing exercises were applied between the hours of 7:30 and 9 p.m. During this 1.5 hours delay, the passengers entertained themselves with exercises in patience. Sunday morning, the first car leaving Brookside for Westford was unable to run, which caused the passengers to suddenly believe that they would rather walk than ride. The organist at the Unitarian Church was among those who loved walking rather than a car a-balking. The first car reached Westford about 10:45, a little over 2 hours late. At a meeting of the selectmen Tuesday evening, Austin H. Foss and J. Herbert Fletcher were drawn to serve on the jury at Lowell the first Monday in October. Joseph E. Knight is ill at his home on the Chelmsford Road, suffering from acute indigestion. Dr. Salter and wife of Oxford, Nova Scotia, have been visiting with old-time friends, the McMaster family, on the Chamberlain Road. Remember the Groton Farmers Fair on the 30th next week. The hills, valleys, and farmers of Groton form a strong combination of production. Let us go and see the combination. Amos Poley has finished sowing quite an acreage of winter wheat, and if there is a sudden drop in the wheat market, lay it to the Stony Brook prospects. Lorenzo Fletcher, for many years a resident of Kansas, has returned to his native town and bought the cottage house, corner of Groton and Forest Road. He is an uncle of our public-spirited and busy stone contractor, Herbert E. Fletcher. The Board of Registration held their first meeting Friday evening of last week at the Selectmen's Room. The members of the board are Town Clerk Edward Fisher, J. Herbert Fletcher, J. Everett Woods, and Samuel L. Taylor. The board organized by choosing J. Everett Woods chairman and also arranged future meetings as follows: Brookside, October 15th from 7:45 to 8:45. Graniteville, October 15th. I think that's probably a mistake because the previous one was October 15th. So this is probably 16th, 17th, 18th, or 19th. From 7:30 to 9 p.m. Forge Village, October 20th, from 7:30 to 9 p.m. And Town Hall, Westford Center, and last chance to register, October 23rd, from noon until 10 p.m. The next section is called Fair. The Middlesex North Fair at Chelmsford Wednesday and Thursday was all it was booked for. Large attendance, large display, and large weather to coax. 57 years ago, Middlesex North organized and held its first fair at Chelmsford. It has seen many trials since and departure from the original agricultural fair, and the recent fair was a return to first POVE, first POVE. I think that's probably a typo, but I'm not sure what the correct word is unless perhaps it's love. The recent fair was returned to first love and first principles, with just enough of the purely agricultural to set off with a jingle. Such was the Chelmsford Brass Band with its merry, chiming trip to, quote, the light, fantastic toe, end quote. They never played more charming and captivating. The horse racing was a little off purely agricultural, and yet not far from the ordinary farm jig, for the premiums were awarded on the basis of the horse that came in last. The horse is to be driven by someone other than the owner without whip. This caused much merriment, as the horse with the greatest speed capacity came in last. The baby show was an elaborate affair in the numberless beauties. Ex-President Roosevelt should have been there. It was encouraging to his view of life. For fireworks, $600 went up in premiums, by the light of which you could read Grange exhibit, first to Chelmsford, second to Billerica, third to Tewksbury, fourth to Draycott. A little closer look, and you can see William H. Decatur of Westford doing the honors to 8 premiums on cattle, blooded stock raised from the famous herd of ex-Governor Goodell of Antrim, New Hampshire. In the display of swine, Mr. Decatur done the honors to several big premiums. The old Oaken Bucket Farm also lugged off first premiums on William's apple, second premium on pumpkins, sweets, and a 50-cent squint from the judges on potatoes. The fair is an affair of cash values balanced encouragingly. As an affair of social life and education, it has done better work for half a century. Of course, Sam Taylor is the farmer of the the Oaken Bucket Farm that's mentioned here. The next section is called Caned, C-A-N-E-D. The gold-headed cane that the Boston Post newspaper has been encouraging the old age with in Yankee New England has found an abiding place in Westford. To the oldest citizen, Selectman Oscar R. Spaulding presented the cane to Theodore Horace Hamblett of the Brookside Precinct. Although in the 90s he retains that quick, sharp, hail, how do you do type of life, as well as a vigorous hail to health. The vexed question of whether womenfolks are citizens and eligible to gold-headed canes is easily answered. As long as any class of people with chain and ball are handcuffed to the ancient law that physical might makes moral right, as long as our civilization is swayed by this law, women are not citizens and need not apply for gold-headed canes. We are only half civilized and are afraid to risk the other half. The caucus is the next paragraph. At the Republican caucus Tuesday evening, Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher, chairman of the town committee, read the call. Edward M. Abbott was chosen chairman and Leonard W. Wheeler secretary. The following delegates had 17 votes each and were elected to the several conventions. State, Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher and George H. Hartford. Councilor, George T. Day, Sherman H. Fletcher. County, Julian A. Cameron, Walter A. Wooden. Senatorial, Alfred W. Hartford, William R. Taylor. Representative, Wesley O. Hawkins, Charles M. Troll, T. Arthur E. Wilson, and Samuel L. Taylor. The town committee elected for 1910 are the Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher, Arthur W. Hartford. He is serving in 1909, I believe, as Westford's representative to the State House. Edward Hanley, Charles M. Troll, Julian A. Cameron, Harry L. Nesmith, T. Arthur E. Wilson, Edward M. Abbott, Wesley O. Hawks, Oscar A. Nelson, Andrew Johnson, Fred A. Sweat, Thomas Dan Lowe, Walter A. Wooden, and Samuel L. Taylor. The next section is the Grange section. Neighbors' night at the Grange last week, Thursday evening, was one of the full-blooming kind. The Concord of early battlegrounds and Tingsboro historic without battlegrounds, nesting in the embrace of the Merrimack, were represented in entertaining numbers, with cornet solos, song solos, I have reaching solos, it's probably reading solos, and remarkable solos. The ladies' degree team of Westford Grange entertained with supper, so nicely attractive that they were invited to participate in the initiation of candidates the first Tuesday evening in October at Tingsboro. The next paragraph is called Troubled Vacation. Reverend and Mrs. Charles C.P. Hiller of Wesley Church, Springfield, have had a troubled vacation. Leaving about the 1st of August for the Adirondacks, Mrs. Hiller was taken ill at Sacandaga Park, New York, and August 29th had to be taken to the hospital at Gloversville, New York, whence she will certainly not be able to return to Springfield until October or later. They have the profound sympathy of their many friends who pray for Mrs. Hiller's speedy recovery. This illness is doubly disappointing, as Reverend and Mrs. Hiller intended to attend the golden wedding of Mr. Hiller's parents, celebrated early this month at the parental home in Michigan. Mr. Hiller will be remembered as the minister of the church in West Chelmsford, Westford Center, and Graniteville in recent years. As resident in West Chelmsford, he was interested in the debating society, serving as critic. Reverend Dr. Hiller served both the Methodist Church in Graniteville and I believe the Unitarian Church in Westford Center at the same time. I think he's the only pastor to serve both parishes at the same time. The next paragraph is called An Old-Time Visitor. Mrs. George D. Noyes of Brookline is visiting her cousin, Miss Ella Wright, at the Lewis T. Fletcher homestead on the Lowell Road. To the residents of Westford who can look back over the history of the town for over half a century, Mrs. Noyes will be remembered as Miss Susan Wright, daughter of John Wright, who was preceptor of Westford Academy from 1823 to 1824, and afterwards a prominent mill agent in Lowell. Her mother was Miss Susan Prescott of Groton, the first lady assistant at the Academy, beginning to teach in 1819. Her grandfather was Nathan Wright, one of the early old residents and owner of the Edwin Gould Farm. That's the farm that's on Gould Road. He had 9 sons: Nathan, Parker, Jotham, Edmund number 2, John, Walter, Martin, and George. Her cousin, Miss Ella Wright, was left by Mrs. Augusta Butterfield the Fletcher homestead and 20 acres of land. The Honorable George J. Burns, administrator of the estate, visited the home Saturday with a surveyor preparatory to making a survey and plan of this old homestead. Miss Wright will return to Ohio about October 1st. I believe she lived in Cleveland and spent her summers in Westford. The next section is Westford Center. Mrs. Nellie P. Draper and daughter Lillian were guests the greater part of last week at Mrs. H.V. Hildreth's. Miss Lillian enters college this fall. Mrs. Annie Christopher of Worcester has come to act as housekeeper at Mrs. Andrew S. Wright's. Mr. and Mrs. Oscar S. Spaulding are enjoying a trip with a large party to Montreal and other Canadian points of interest. Mrs. Stockdale is spending a few weeks with Miss Miranda Luce and enjoying greetings of her former Westford friends. Miranda Ruth was one of the daughters of Reverend Leonard Luce, who was the first pastor of the Congregational Church in Westford Center in 1829, I believe. Dr. Edward Atwood and Mrs. Atwood, who have spent the summer with northern relatives, returned to their Florida home this week. Miss Evelyn remains at the north for some time longer. The next section is called Fair. The annual agricultural fair and sale under the auspices of the Congregational Church took place at the Town Hall Wednesday afternoon and evening and was very much of a success. The dry season that the farmers have had to contend with made the exhibit not as extensive as usual, but what there was of it was good and attractively arranged. Fruit, vegetables, and flowers received the usual admiring attention. The Mrs. Atwood had an entire table devoted to the products of their small garden, and the results were most commendable. The 3 Atwood sisters lived at 4 Graniteville Road, just down the street from Main Street. There were products noted from the gardens of Mrs. Misses Wilson, Bunce, Taylor, Reed, Wheeler, Osgood, Hildreth, McDougall, Whitney, and Bridgeford. Emery J. Whitney had some corn about 14 feet high. Among odd things were some fine red currants, some plants of the wonderberry, some fine clusters of crimson rambler roses, also lentils and kohlrabi. Houghton G. Osgood had his usual good display of many varieties of apples. Mrs. Osgood's usual collection of jellies were missed owing to ill health. There were some fine specimens of canned vegetables and fruits done by the lady of the parsonage. I believe Houghton Osgood owned one of the orchards up on Francis Hill on the west side of, on the Westford-Chelmsford line. There were sales tables for fancy articles, aprons, food, candy, and the Mother Goose booth for the children, all of which received a generous patronage. The candy table was the usual attraction with good homemade candy. This was trimmed with butterflies of crepe paper. The fancy table came next, and the committee disposed of a large amount of articles, both useful and ornamental. This booth had green and white for its decoration, with a generous use of hydrangeas to complete it. The ever-useful apron table did a good business, selling entirely out early in the evening. This table was trimmed with crepe paper in maize design. On the opposite side of the hall and across the front were display tables, food table, and Mother Goose booth. The very realistic old goose handed out the various articles to the children until the supply was exhausted. The food table, with its good homemade food, was sold out comparatively early in the afternoon, notwithstanding the sale of other eatables. During the afternoon, J.H. Foss gave selections from his graphophone, and the entertainment in the evening consisted of a dramatic presentation by talent from the young people from the Pawtucket Church in Lowell. The graphophone mentioned here was a type of phonograph developed in the laboratories of Alexander Graham Bell that used a floating stylus that cut, quote, hill and dale, end quote, grooves in a waxed cardboard cylinder. It provided a significantly better sound quality than Thomas Alva Edison's phonograph. Ice cream was on sale during the afternoon, and from 6 to 8, a good old-fashioned supper was served. This was capably managed, and the long tables were well filled. The various ones who had charge of the various features feel grateful to their faithful helpers and for the generous patronage from others who helped to make the annual fair the success it was. It was pleasant to have in attendance in the afternoon Mrs. Dorothy Sleeper Hartwell and Miss Natalie Sleeper, who came over from camp where they were staying. The Sleeper sisters were daughters of Dr. and Mrs. Walter Sleeper, who died in Westford in 1908 and 1907, respectively. The next section is the Graniteville section. Mr. and Mrs. F.D. Riney, with Miss Etta May and Ellis C. Sheehan of Lowell, visited friends in this village recently. The members of the A.R. Choate Hose Company are now making arrangements for a field day, followed by a social dance, to be held in this village on Saturday, October 2nd. The members of the A.R. Choate Hose Company were out for practice duty on Monday evening, and during the tryout, one of the water pipes on First Street suddenly burst, and the quick flow of water caused considerable excitement in that vicinity for a few minutes until it was shut off by Superintendent Sutherland of the water company. The pipe was repaired the next day. Next paragraph is the baseball paragraph. The Crescent Baseball Club of Lowell visited here on last Saturday afternoon, and in one of the slowest and most uninteresting games of the season, defeated the Graniteville Blues by the score of 12-6. Thomas McCarthy, the regular pitcher, was not in the Blues lineup, and John Spinner was substituted at the last moment. Spinner did excellent work, having 10 strikeouts to his credit and fielding his position in good shape. The Blues gave him wretched support, the work of the infield being very yellow at times. Neither side appeared to care which way the game went, and it was a great relief to the spectators when the last man was put out. It was really the worst exhibition of baseball playing that has been seen here this season, and entirely devoid of interest. The boys cannot be blamed much, as they were not over anxious to play anyway, and had just finished a very strenuous season and given a good account of themselves. The Crescent showed flashes of fast work at times, but toward the last grew tired and careless. Spinner, Gordon, Ledwith, and Heeman did the battery work for the Blues. This account of the baseball game is quite unusual in the extent of its criticism of the players and the way they played. Next is the Forge Village section. Wilbert E. Parsons has sold his place, known as the Comey Place of this village, to Henry M. Story of Hudson, formerly a resident of this place. The social season will commence here Saturday evening, September 25th. The ladies of the Sewing Circle will give a bean supper in Recreation Hall from 6 to 8 p.m., after which will be a social hour with dancing. Town water will be installed in St. Andrew's Mission this week. The expenses will be met by the Ladies' Sewing Circle. Wilbert E. Parsons attended the campfire at Leominster with the George S. Boutwell Post 48 of Ayer last Saturday. This was a Grand Army of the Republic post, and Mr. Parsons served the last couple of months of the Civil War in the 8th Maine Infantry. And the last section is called Reunion. The 14th annual reunion of the Jonathan Smith Bennett Association was held at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Sarah McIntyre at Shrewsbury Monday, September 8th. 42 members were present, among whom were 5 of the children of Jonathan S. Bennett. The remaining 2, Abijah S. Bennett of Wisconsin and Dr. H. M. Bennett of Washington, were absent. The family are direct descendants of James Bennett of Groton, who married March 23, 1703, Hannah Barrett, spelled B-A-R-E-T in the old records, at Reading, and resided in Groton. That's the news in Westford for the week ending September 25th, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.